20 years of China's presence at the World Trade Organization. We examine its legacy and impact. And later, an important economic meeting in China that sets benchmarks for 2022. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization after 15 years of negotiations. Since then, China has become the world's second biggest economy and largest trading nation. CGTN's Chengxi has more.
China joined the World Trade Organization 2 decades ago, and since then, the country has been benefited immensely by the market economy and global free trade.
I think it was right. It benefited both China and the rest of the world.
China has not only benefited, it's also been one of the biggest contributors to global trade by delivering on its accession commitments.
China's overall tariff rate has been cut from 15.3% to 7.4%, lower than the 9.8% accession commitment. The central government has reviewed and revised over 2,300 laws and regulations, and local governments over 190,000, which have all helped to unleash market and social vitality.
Regulatory reform is still an ongoing process, with China's investment negative list continuing to shrink over time.
Experts say while opening up new sectors is good for long-term development, it nonetheless puts the existing industries under great pressure from competition. It is a move that requires political courage, and it wouldn't have been pushed forward effectively without China's explicit commitments to the WTO.
20 years after joining the trade organization, China expects to play an even bigger role in the future.
Right now, the multilateral trading regime faces challenges. China supports the WTO reform in moving in the right direction.
But this is also a complicated matter.
The problems US have with WTO, the problems EU has with WTO, the problems China has with WTO may not be the same.
For example, some developed economies are pushing for an overhaul of the WTO's trade practice rulebook, especially in terms of industrial subsidies. But China is advocating for more inclusiveness in the WTO.
We support the inclusive development of the multilateral trading regime, as well as the legitimate rights and interests of the developing members. China will take an active and open attitude in negotiations on issues such as the digital economy, trade and the environment, industrial subsidies, and state-owned enterprises.
Despite differences between nations, President Xi says China upholds the position of the WTO as the main channel for setting international rules. As the world faces a difficult trade climate, experts say the WTO and China's role in it could become more important than ever. Yang Chengxi, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, to discuss this anniversary and more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is Liang. She is a professor of economics at Willamette University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Neysun Mahboubi is a research scholar with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. My apologies. Liang is actually in Oregon. And joining us from Israel is Gong. He is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Gong, let me start with you. In 2000, China was the 6th largest global economy behind the United States, Japan, Germany, UK, and France. Now, in the space of 20 years, it is the world's 2nd biggest economy, and current estimates, projections tell us that in just a few years, it could be the world's largest economy. In fact, by one measure, the so-called purchasing power parity, it is already the biggest economy in the world. China joined the WTO in 2001. What did accession to the WTO do for China?
Well, the accession to the WTO definitely contribute to transforming China into more of a market economy. It immensely contributes to China's economic growth. It provides immense opportunities for its exports market. But I need to, bring a grain of salt to the idea, the narrative actually, that China's economic success of the last 40 years is almost exclusively attributed to the accession to the WTO. That's just not correct in my view. I mean, China's economic reform and the economic rebounding already started when Mr. Deng Xiaoping took over power in 1978 and began the open door policy, began the reform policy. So this is, really 20 years before the accession to the WTO. So WTO played accession to WTO played a very important role. It definitely enhances China's provides many more opportunities outside of China's market, and also accelerates probably the transformation of the sort of a Soviet-style market, Soviet-style economy, planned economy into a market economy. And all those things are very positive from China's perspective, but I think the narrative that it's exclusively attributed to the WTO is just not appropriate in my view.
Liang, great to see you. China's GDP was 4% of global GDP in 2001. Now it is 17%. How did that growth change China domestically?
Well, good to talk to you, Anand. So I think, with this high growth that, as Gong talked about, China really has transformed itself, lifting 800 million people out of extreme poverty, and also achieving, great technological innovations, and also, promoting this kinds of shared prosperity among 1.4 billion people. So, of course, China's contributions go beyond just its own economic growth. It has accounted for about 1/3 of the global growth in the past 10, 20 years. So I think, in a way, China's accession to WTO not only benefited China, not just because the export demand, but also foreign direct investment, also because that greater competition and collaboration, and also the certification of its reform and opening. So all of these, I think, benefit China tremendously. But of course, China's prosperity also contributes to the world growth.
And what were the main drivers of that growth that we're talking about? 4% in 2001 to 17% of world GDP right now.
I think if you look at the historical record, right, so there are sort of extensive growth, growth patterns. So there's increase in, capital, labor, natural resources to the production process. But there's also the so-called intensive growth, which is that productivity growth has also contributed to that rapid growth rate. So again, this has to do with China's reform and opening, has to do with the greater, competition and productivity growth.
Neysun Mahboubi, accession to the WTO accelerated China's engagement with the world, but there have been efforts to restrict that, to restrict China's ability to open up more trade links in the world. I mean, when we think of President Trump and his so-called poison pill trade deals, restricting countries doing business with the United States from signing free trade agreements with China. How did that impact China?
Well, first, I do want to underscore how much I agree with the first premise of your question, which is that accession to the WTO very much brought China into the world trading system. I actually started studying Chinese around that time, and I remember before China had acceded to the WTO, before the U.S. had granted China most favored nation trading status, and the kinds of political debates that were especially robust in the United States about both of those steps. And yes, absolutely, we have seen in the last few years, starting in the Trump administration, but I think continuing through the Biden administration, efforts now to walk some of that engagement of China in the world trading system back. Whether or not that's really possible, whether it's really possible to put the genie back in the bottle at this point, I'm not sure. But what I think it does reflect to some degree, and this is not the whole story, but it reflects to some degree a sense of disappointment that China may not have liberalized its economy as much as had been hoped by many of the people who argued for China to join the WTO back in the 1990s. That's sort of what I think is a big driver for it. Now, part of it could also be that China's become very powerful economically, and there's just a concern about that on its own terms. But I do think some of this does link back to the hopes that drove the support for China to join the WTO back in the 1990s.
And it's a two-way street, isn't it, Neysun? I mean, the WTO membership did open the rest of the world up to China, but it also opened China up to the rest of the world, didn't it?
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of people who would say that, yes, in some ways, China has not liberalized as much economically as had been hoped, or perhaps politically, but that China has become much more open to the rest of the world as a function of the accession to WTO. And this is the kind of thing that is being debated, I think, quite robustly in my scholarly circles and in policy debates as well.
John Gong, membership of the WTO also led to significant changes in China itself. There was the easing of regulatory laws, rules, and that was from the national level all the way through to the local level in China. How significant have those changes been?
These are very significant changes. I think, what's sort of lost in the debate regarding China's transformation as probably envisioned initially is what's lost in that debate is that a lot of these things have really changed compared to when China accessed the WTO 20 years ago. For example, at the time you look at in real words about the terms China was accessed to the WTO, a lot of things we don't talk about this anymore. For example, we dismantled a dual pricing system, for example. These are the legacies of the Soviet-style planned economy. We changed many laws, I think in numbers in the hundreds of laws and regulations, again, legacy of the old system. All these are very fundamental, very significant changes. Now, with respect to the question of whether these changes are enough to say that China is adhering to its commitment, whether China has transformed itself in the spirit of the market economy as people, United States government at the time envisioned. I think this is a very different debate here. I mean, there's one thing about whether China adhered to its commitment. There's quite another thing about whether China has lived up to the spirit of the WTO as the U.S. governments and many politicians at the time in the United States had envisioned when China was accepted to the WTO. These are very different questions in my view, and I think we cannot mix them together. I think for the first question, I think there's no doubt about China's meeting almost all the commitments we made at the time. Regarding the second question, I think it's very debatable. I think it's we can put on the table and talk about this. But I think what's really important from a legal perspective, from a political perspective, is really about the first question. And as long as China has made its commitments, there shouldn't be a lot of criticism leveled against China. And as long as China is still moving towards that direction, the direction towards a more open market, a more liberalized economy, a more market-oriented economy. And these are still the things that the current administration in Beijing, President Xi, have been pretty much emphasizing all around, that we are really still moving towards that direction.
Liang, can you give us some perspective on how this expansion of China's trade relations with the rest of the world not only benefited China, but it really increased global GDP, didn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So we all know that China is the export powerhouse, but the matter of fact is that China has also contributed greatly, to other countries' exports. So China's imports have grown from, about 244 billion before the WTO accession to now almost 2.1 trillion. And in terms of the foreign companies that operate in China, it started about 20,000, and now we have 340,000 foreign companies that are making profits in China. So that's just a very important numbers, I think, that we should look at when we assess China's contribution to the trading system. Not to mention, with the pandemic, China is the manufacturing powerhouse for the PPEs. China makes 40 masks for everyone on average, right, around the globe. So I think it's understatement to say, China only benefits from the WTO, and it's not played by the rule book, and therefore it disadvantaged the United States, as President Trump has claimed, which is completely, I think, unfair to China. One thing that I also wanted to add to Zheng Gong's point about China's reform and opening, this is a long and gradual process. I think China has made a lot of efforts, especially in the recent years, but it takes hundreds of years for other developed countries to develop and establish their own market institutions. And so it would be not fair for China, right, to finish everything in 20 years or 40 years for that matter. So I think this is a gradual process, and it's important for China to maintain that gradual opening. And just look at how the private sector has now becoming the dominant player in the economy, right? Going from GDP contribution to employment to tax revenues, you name it. So I think China is moving towards the right direction.
Okay, we are joined now from Miami in Florida by John Quelch. He is the Dean of the Herbert Business School at the University of Miami. John, great to see you. We are talking about, of course, 20 years of China at the WTO, and in that time it has grown from the world's 6th largest economy to the 2nd largest economy, and soon will possibly be the world's biggest economy. What is your view on 20 years? What has it done for China?
I think it's been a fantastic 20 years, and I totally agree with the comments that were just made. China's rise and China's gift to the world as the factory to the world has been an enormous benefit to consumers worldwide in terms of prices that could not have been imagined at retail in so many goods sectors and so many commodities. So China embraced the opportunity that the West gave it to become the manufacturing driving force of the world economy, and did so with a level of efficiency and effectiveness that's very commendable. Now, of course, there are concerns, there are differences of opinion regarding compliance with WTO rules. There is obvious environmental fallout from the effort to aggressively increase manufacturing production. But the bottom line is net, China's rise has been a gift to the world economy, and the world is not merely a more prosperous place as a result of China's entering the WTO. I believe it's also a safer place because trade and investment flows are in many respects a very strong guarantee of peace among nations. And obviously peace is very important to prosperity.
John Quelch, as you say, there are concerns about the functioning of the WTO. In fact, we heard President Xi Jinping in that report at the beginning of the show tell us that the multilateral trade regime is now facing major challenges. What do you see as some of those major challenges?
Well, the WTO is, like many international organizations, underfunded and perhaps also underappreciated. And being underfunded does not have the resources to quickly and effectively respond to changes in trade patterns or to specific complaints that individual nations may lodge against each other. So the speed with which the WTO can operate and effectively implement its mandate is severely constrained. And I would very much like to see the U.S. get back into the mode, as I think is happening, but get back into the mode of nurturing and leading the way and properly funding these international organizations that are actually very important to the frictionless transactions that represent good trade practice.
Neysun Mahboubi, you were telling us a moment ago that when, at this time, of course, it's felt among many countries, the United States being one of them, that China's economy is not liberalized enough after 20 years of the WTO. But when China joined the WTO 20 years ago, that effort to join the WTO was strongly supported by the United States, by President Clinton during those negotiations. But there was a different hope at the time, wasn't there? It wasn't just about the Chinese economy. There was a hope that this would change China politically.
Yeah, I think it's a very complex debate, and there's a lot of work that tries to go back and parse exactly what President Clinton said, exactly what other administration officials said at the time. Were they predicting or hoping for a real extensive political transition or more marginal political reforms? I think one thing that's very clear, and that was expressed earlier in the conversation by Gong, is that China did actually do a lot to rationalize its administrative law and regulation in the aftermath of the WTO accession, because it had to, because of these WTO plus requirements, in ways that were designed by the drafters of that accession agreement and the plus agreements to make the environment in China more hospitable and attractive to foreign investors, but then had real benefits for domestic Chinese companies and citizens. People like Professor Yeling Tan, also at the University of Oregon, have written about this extensively, and others. And so I think it's not clear that nothing has changed in China as a result of the accession to WTO in terms of its political system or in terms of its law. It just may be that the amount of change is not as much as some people either hope or some people think that was hoped for at the time. And that's something that's being discussed, I think, very, very vigorously in the current moment.
Okay, let's move on to our next topic, and that is China's Central Economic Work Conference, which just wrapped up in Beijing. Its focus was on maintaining economic stability as the country heads into 2022. What are some of the key challenges next year, and how does Beijing plan to address them? Well, let's continue with our panel right now. And Gong, let me start with you. That conference, as I said, just wrapped up in Beijing. It's an important conference for setting the agenda for China. So what were the main takeaways?
Well, my takeaway is that the message has been quite somber. Actually, I mean, it's prepared for some bad news coming. I would expect some bad news will be coming. Actually, the current economy, all indications are saying that there are some problems. There's some immense challenges, not the least of which is just repeated outbreaks of these the COVID infections here and there, just nonstop throughout the winter at this point in Beijing and to the rest of the world, rest of China, and also I think the international markets, the overseas markets are still not coming back yet. The COVID is a huge challenge worldwide, and I think on top of this, there are also challenges with the real estate market. One of the 8 tasks mentioned explicitly mentioned that, and there are also several other sectors, tech sectors, for example. Undergoing regulatory review, regulatory oversight, and the antitrust enforcement against several companies, things like that, of that nature. So I think if you look at the overall picture, I think it's a very somber picture here. My projection is that we probably will be barely, if we are very lucky, we'll barely make the 8% growth this year, as the World Bank predicts. So I think overall, it's a sort of preparing for the worst. And the document mentions that both fiscal and monetary policies will be introduced. Yeah. I expect some major actions on the fiscal side.
Liang, that somber picture that Gong talks about there, we also heard some of that from the conference, in fact. We heard that when we look at China's economic developments, it's facing pressure from lower demand, it's facing pressure from supply issues, and what were called weakening expectations. In fact, one report said another factor is that the external environment is also becoming, quote, complicated, grim, and uncertain. What do you make of that?
Right. So the report did talk about this triple crises or triple pressures, actually. So I think, the diagnosis is sober. And I think that, yes, that's why I think the government said that stability is going to be the top priority for next year. So I think the goal is not to achieve another 8% or even higher or growth rate, but rather really to try to stabilize. And the government is prepared to so-called front load some of the policies. But what I'm glad to see is they call for prudent monetary policy. So again, continue to inject liquidity to the markets, or trying to go back to that debt-driven growth. It's no longer really in the playbook. So yes, they did call for more proactive fiscal policies. So I think that is really on the right track. They also talked about, continue to enforce anti-monopoly laws to, provide more market competition, as well as, trying to address the technological innovations and many other aspects that I think would really help to strengthen, supply side resilience, and also trying to, boost demand side growth.
John Quelch, we also heard the conference propose tax cuts and support for entrepreneurs. There wasn't much detail on what that entails, but is it new? I mean, they want that to be the main driver of growth.
Well, certainly, as has been stated, China has had to pivot its economic growth policy from a debt-driven approach to a policy that relies much more on consumption. And when you rely on consumption, you have to make sure that consumers have money to spend, and in addition to that, that they have the confidence in their expectations to go out and spend it. And so accordingly, moving towards fiscal management, fiscal adjustments that potentially put more money back into the economy that way, I think is the appropriate approach at this point. Yes, it's always the case that stability is important in China, but let's not forget that if 8% is achieved this year, that's a remarkable track record continuing over the course of the last 20 to 30 years. And even if only 5% growth were to be achieved in 2022, that would also be a commendable level of growth relative to what we're expecting in the rest of the world. I would expect the 5% to be exceeded, but in that eventuality, that also would be a very strong performance, given that China's economy is now at a level where to ask for 8% growth year on year is really to ask for an incredible amount of effort. So I'm still optimistic about the Chinese economy going forward, though I understand why the decision makers have, of course, issued a note of caution.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.